In the Louvre Museum in Paris, housed in a separate and perpetually crowded room, behind thick, bulletproof laminated glass and within a controlled microclimate, hangs the most famous, most expensive, most heavily guarded, and most enigmatic painting in the world. Every year, around 10 million people from every continent line up for hours in a queue that snakes through the museum's corridors just to gaze into her eyes for a few fleeting, strictly regulated seconds. Her name is Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda. But the main question that has captivated minds for 5 centuries is not who she was. The main question is, who was he? But before we unveil the true face of this incredible genius, if you're captivated by these kinds of fascinating historical figures, be sure to subscribe to our channel, Personalities in Detail. Leave a like, hit the notification bell, and let's decode history together. Who was the man capable of using crushed minerals, oil, and a thin poplar wood panel not just to create a portrait, but a living, breathing, pulsating mystery that drives the world mad with its fleeting smile, at once mocking and sorrowful? His name is Leonardo da Vinci, and this name is so overgrown with myths, legends, Hollywood blockbusters, and conspiracy theories that the real, living person has almost completely vanished behind the titanic, superhuman image of the genius. We know him as a painter, the creator of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. But that is only the tip of the iceberg, just one, albeit the most brilliant and understandable, facet of this incredible, impossible diamond. What if I told you that Leonardo himself did not primarily see himself as a painter, but as an engineer and a scientist? That while creating his divine, soulful canvases, he secretly at night, by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, and at risk of being accused of heresy, witchcraft, and necromancy, illegally dissected the corpses of executed criminals and the poor in hospital basements, all to draw and comprehend, with the precision of a surgeon, every muscle, every nerve, every heartbeat, to understand how the perfect machine of the human body functions. That he designed armored tanks, submarines, machine guns, diving suits, and flying machines akin to helicopters, and did so 400 years before they were actually invented. What did he leave behind? More than 7,000 pages of encrypted diaries written with his left hand in mirror script, which to this day have not been fully deciphered, and contain more original ideas than those of hundreds of other geniuses combined. This is not the story of a painter. It is the story of a man who wanted to know everything. He was an anatomist, botanist, geologist, paleontologist, engineer, musician, architect, inventor, and philosopher. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the absolute essence of the Renaissance. Uomo universale, a universal man whose genius was so all-encompassing that it seemed supernatural, almost extraterrestrial. But he was also a deeply tragic, lonely figure, an illegitimate son, an eternal wanderer without a home of his own, a genius who started hundreds of grand projects but completed almost none of them, always swept away by a new, even more ambitious quest. So who was he really? A misunderstood genius, a century ahead of his time? A heretic who peered beyond the limits of the permissible, trying to decipher the Creator's own code? Or, as some believe, a time traveler accidentally stranded in the cruel and ignorant 15th century? To attempt to answer this question, we must travel to the heart of the Italian Renaissance, into the bubbling cauldron of intrigue, art, science, and power, to the Florence of Lorenzo the Magnificent's era. He was born on the 15th of April, 1452, in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, surrounded by olive groves, from which he took his surname, meaning from Vinci. And from the very beginning, his status in this rigidly structured, hierarchical world was marked with a stamp of shame. He was born illegitimate. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a young, ambitious, and successful notary, a member of a respected intellectual profession. And his mother, a certain Caterina, was a simple peasant girl, perhaps even a tavern maid, about whom we know almost nothing. In that world, this was a lifelong stain. An illegitimate son, or bastard, could not join his father's guild, could not study at a university to receive a classical humanist education, and could not inherit his position or fortune. For him, all respectable paths intended for decent people were closed. He was an outsider from birth, yet this very curse became his greatest gift. Since he lacked the opportunity to study the world from dusty Latin tomes and copy the opinions of ancient authorities, as the scholastic university scholars did, he began to look at the world with his own eyes. He did not read Aristotle on how birds fly. He would lie for hours in the fields, sketching with the fresh insight of an entomologist every movement of a kite's wings, every phase of its flap, to understand the aerodynamics of flight. He did not study theological treatises on the nature of water as a symbol. He sat by the raging Arno River, drawing with the alert obsession of a madman every vortex, every current, every drop that shattered upon impact with a stone, to grasp the hidden geometry of chaos. His only teacher became nature itself, and his only authority was his own experience, his own eyes. Wisdom, he would later write in his journals, is the daughter of experience. He proudly declared himself an uomo senza lettere, a man without formal education, transforming this formal flaw into his greatest methodological strength. His father, though he did not give him his name and quickly married another, did not abandon him to his fate. He recognized his son's extraordinary, almost frightening talent for drawing. When Leonardo was about 14 years old, Ser Piero took him to Florence and showed his drawings to a friend who was not just a painter, but the owner of the best, most famous, and most versatile art workshop of the era, the Bottega of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's workshop was no ordinary art studio where one learned to mix paints. It was a true technology hub, the Silicon Valley of the 15th century. Here they not only painted pictures and created statues for wealthy Florentine families and churches, they designed war machines for the Duke of Milan, constructed complex mechanical sets for lavish theatrical performances, cast gigantic bronze monuments like the equestrian statue of Condottiere Corleone in Venice, and engaged in goldsmithing, architecture, and cartography. It was the perfect, almost paradisiacal environment for the all-consuming, insatiable, and boundless mind of the young Leonardo. Here his curiosity knew no bounds. He studied chemistry, spending hours grinding minerals and mixing them with oil to create new colors. He studied metallurgy while working in the foundry. He studied anatomy, sketching tense muscles for statues. He studied optics and geometry, mastering the laws of perspective that would form the foundation of his painting. And very soon it became clear that this illegitimate youth from the provinces was not just a talented student. He was a genius. The legend, recorded by the first art historian, Giorgio Vasari, tells that while working on the great altarpiece, the Baptism of Christ, Verrocchio tasked his young but already most talented apprentice, Leonardo, with painting the figure of one of the two angels. When Leonardo finished, his angel appeared so lifelike, so soulful, its golden curls so soft and its gaze so deep and sorrowful, that it seemed like a divine being compared to the coarser, more static, and more traditional figures painted by Verrocchio himself. The aging master, it is said, fell into despair at the sight, threw down his brush, and never touched a painting again, recognizing the complete, crushing superiority of his student. At the age of 20, Leonardo was accepted into the Painters Guild and was now an independent master. But he was in no hurry. While other young and ambitious artists, like his eternal rival Sandro Botticelli, mass-produced Madonnas for wealthy patrons, gaining fame and fortune, Leonardo could spend years on a single small painting. He experimented endlessly with the composition of paints, which would later lead to the tragedy of The Last Supper, studied human emotions, and made thousands of preliminary studies for every detail. He was less interested in the final result, or the fee, than in the process of discovery itself. He was obsessed with the idea of capturing on a flat canvas not just an external likeness, but what he called moti dell'animo, the motions of the soul, the hidden fleeting thoughts and feelings of a person expressed in a barely perceptible gesture, in a turn of the head, in an enigmatic half-smile melting on the lips. But Florence, the cultural capital of the world, ruled by the brilliant patron Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent, had become too confining for him. Here he was valued as a talented, albeit agonizingly slow and unreliable painter, but no one was interested in his engineering, scientific, and military ambitions. Here the cult of beauty, Plato's philosophy, and the humanities reigned, not technology and mechanics. And so, at the age of 30, he took a decisive and bold step. He wrote a job application letter, perhaps the most unusual and self-assured in history, and sent it to the ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, a pragmatic, ambitious, and warlike man. This letter is one of the most astonishing documents of the era and the key to understanding who Leonardo considered himself to be. It consists of 10 points, and in the first 9, the most detailed, Leonardo describes talents as a military engineer with absolute, almost brazen confidence. He writes, "I can build bridges that are extremely light, strong, and highly portable. I know how to drain water from the moats during the siege of a fortress and destroy any fortress, even if it is built on rock. I can build mortars that are convenient and easy to transport, which hurl stones like a hailstorm, their smoke terrifying the enemy. I can build covered wagons, safe and unassailable, that will break through enemy ranks with their artillery." Prototypes of tanks. "I can design catapults, trebuchets, and other throwing machines of astonishing effectiveness. For naval battles, I can construct many machines for attack and defense." And only at the very end, in the last 10th point, almost as an afterthought, almost reluctantly, he modestly adds, "In times of peace, I believe I can give perfect satisfaction in architecture, like any other, as well as in the construction of canals for the benefit of the country. I can also execute any work in sculpture, whether in marble, bronze, or clay, as well as in painting. I can do anything that is possible for another, whoever he may be. He offers himself to Milan not as a great painter, but as a universal genius, an expert in the technologies of war and peace. Ludovico Sforza, a ruler living under the constant threat of war with Venice and France, made the correct, pragmatic decision. He did not need another painter. He needed a brilliant military engineer. He invited Leonardo into his service. In the year 1482, Leonardo left the refined, artistic Florence and headed for the rough, bustling, militarized Milan. He did not yet know that he would spend the 17 most productive and perhaps happiest years of his life here. Here he would create his most tragic and monumental painting, The Last Supper. Here he would begin his most dangerous and forbidden research, dissecting human bodies in hospital basements. And here he would come closest to his craziest, most obsessive dream, the dream of flight. When Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Milan in 1482, he entered a completely different world, a different universe. While his hometown of Florence was a republic, a city of proud citizens, bankers, poets, and philosophers, where power was veiled and divided among councils and guilds, Milan was a duchy, a strict, almost Spartan military dictatorship under the sole rule of Ludovico Sforza. Il Moro, as he was called for his dark complexion and dark hair, was a ruthless, cunning, treacherous, and incredibly ambitious man. He had seized power by ousting his rightful nephew and ruled with an iron fist, relying not on the love of the people, but on Swiss mercenaries and an extensive network of spies. His court at the Castello Sforzesco was one of the most magnificent and at the same time most dangerous in Europe. Here, what was valued was not so much the sophistication of Florentine philosophy as raw power, ostentatious wealth, and state-of-the-art military technology. And paradoxically, such a patron was exactly what Leonardo needed. Unlike the refined Florentine patrons who saw in Leonardo only a talented but strange and unreliable painter, Ludovico recognized something greater in him. In the author of that bold letter, he saw not just a painter, but a universal genius, a man for all seasons, capable of simultaneously glorifying his rule with magnificent works of art and strengthening his military might with deadly machines. Leonardo received the official title of Pictor et Ingeniarius Ducalis, ducal painter and engineer, and was granted virtually unlimited carte blanche for the most diverse and sometimes wildest of projects. His Milanese period, which lasted 17 years, became the most productive and perhaps the happiest in his restless life. He was everything at once. His energy and curiosity seemed to know no bounds. He served as the court's chief master of festivities, creating incredible fairy tale-like spectacles for Sforza and his young wife, Beatrice d'Este. These were not mere masquerades, but complex engineering productions. For one of them, the Feast of Paradise, he constructed a rotating celestial sphere with planets and live actors portraying gods who descended from the heavens to greet the Duke. For another, he designed a mechanical line that could walk independently across the hall and stop before the King of France, at which point its chest would open like a casket, releasing heraldic lilies. He was an architect, working on projects to complete the Milan Cathedral and developing plans for Ludovico for an ideal city with two level streets, the upper level for the nobility and pedestrians, the lower, well ventilated, for carts, commerce, and the sewer system. This was an idea that urban planning would not revisit until the 20th century. He was a hydraulic engineer, designing a complex system of canals and locks intended to turn the landlocked city of Milan into a seaport by connecting it to rivers and lakes. And of course, he was a military engineer, fulfilling the promises made in his letter. In his famous notebooks, the codices he constantly maintained, he developed hundreds of projects for war machines, each more fantastic than the last. That armored car, resembling a tortoise or a flying saucer, armed with cannons on all sides and powered by 8 men inside, was effectively the first detailed design for a tank in history. He designed gigantic crossbows capable of hurling massive stones, multi-barreled guns resembling an organ, precursors to machine guns, mobile assault bridges, and even a leather diving suit with reeds for breathing and an air bladder intended for saboteurs to swim undetected under the hulls of enemy ships and pierce them. Most of these projects were never realized. The technology of the era simply did not permit their construction with the necessary efficiency, but they demonstrate the incredible scope and direction of his thinking. He thought like a strategist, an inventor, a person from the future. However, the most important and ambitious project Ludovico entrusted to him, which was to become the symbol of the Sforza dynasty's power, was the creation of the world's largest equestrian statue. It was to be a gigantic 8-meter-high bronze monument in honor of Ludovico's father, the great condottiero Francesco Sforza. Driven by a passion bordering on madness, Leonardo threw himself into this project. For him, it was not just a commission, but a challenge to the entire world, an opportunity to surpass the ancient masters. He spent years on preparatory work. He made hundreds of anatomical drawings of horses, studying the structure of their muscles, tendons, and the mechanics of their movements to achieve unprecedented realism and dynamism. He wanted to depict the horse not standing still, but rearing. He developed a revolutionary technology to cast such a gigantic statue in a single piece of bronze to avoid seams. In 1493, he finally presented the full-scale clay model of the horse, Il Grande Cavallo, to the public. It was installed in the courtyard of the Castello Sforzesco and caused a sensation. Contemporaries, including poets and ambassadors, wrote enthusiastic reports about it, calling it the 8th wonder of the world. Everything was ready for the casting, but then, as so often happened in his life, high politics intervened in his plans. The French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, and Ludovico Sforza was forced to melt down all the bronze prepared for the monument, nearly 70 tons of the precious metal, to cast cannons to buy his freedom. The greatest sculptural project of the Renaissance was destroyed before it was even born. For Leonardo, this was one of the greatest tragedies of his creative life. Yet it was in Milan, against the backdrop of these grandiose and often failed projects, that he also created 2 of his most famous masterpieces of painting. The first is the portrait of one of the Duke's young and educated favorites, Cecilia Gallerani, known as the Lady with an Ermine. With this painting, he sparked a true revolution in the genre of portraiture. Instead of the static, frozen, medallion-like profile portraits common at the time, he painted the young woman in a complex, dynamic turn, at the very moment she hears something just outside the frame and turns her elegant head. He captured not just a face, but a fleeting movement, a thought, an emotion. He brought the portrait to life, transforming it into a psychological drama. The second masterpiece, which became the pinnacle of his creative work, and one of the greatest tragedies in art history, is the mural The Last Supper in the refectory of the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria della Grazia. Ludovico Sforza had commissioned this work to transform the modest monastery into his family's mausoleum. Leonardo worked on it for almost 4 years, from 1495 to 1498, and once again he decided to defy all rules and traditions. Traditional fresco painting required fast, almost feverish work on wet plaster before it dried. But this went against Leonardo's nature. He wanted to work slowly, deliberately, standing for hours before the wall, contemplating a single gesture, making countless changes, and achieving the finest transitions of light and shadow, which were impossible in a classic fresco. And so he undertook a risky and ultimately disastrous experiment. He decided to paint the Last Supper with tempera and oil directly onto the dry wall, which he had first coated with a complex ground layer of resin and mastic of his own invention. From an artistic perspective, this allowed him to achieve unprecedented results. He did not depict the static, symbolic moment of communion as hundreds of painters before him had done, but rather the most dramatic, psychologically tense moment of the entire gospel. The instant when Jesus has just spoken the fateful, deafening words, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." Leonardo, acting as a brilliant director and psychologist, captured a true explosion of human emotions on the wall. The 12 apostles, divided into 4 dynamic groups of 3, each react in their own way to these words, with shock, anger, confusion, fear, denial. Peter furiously clutches the knife with which he will cut off the ear of the high priest's servant a few hours later. The young John, the beloved disciple, faints from grief. And only one man physically withdraws from this current of emotion, retreating into the shadows and instinctively clutching the bag with the 30 pieces of silver: Judas. For the first time in history, Leonardo painted Judas not isolated at the other end of the table, as was customary, but among the other apostles, thereby showing that betrayal arises not somewhere outside, but from within one's own circle, at the same table. He spent months wandering the alleys of Milan, through taverns and even prisons, searching the faces of passers-by, drinkers, and criminals for features that could serve as models for his apostles. It is said that he painted the head of Judas based on the prior of the monastery, who constantly rushed him at his work and complained to the Duke about his slowness. But from a technical standpoint, his brilliant experiment proved to be a catastrophe. The paint applied to the dry, non-absorbent wall began to flake and crumble even within Leonardo's lifetime. His greatest masterpiece began to die almost as soon as it was born, transforming into a shadow of its former self. And all these years, while working for the Duke, creating masterpieces and designing machines, he led his secret, second, and perhaps most important life, the life of a scientist, a researcher interested not only in art and engineering, but in the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of life itself, its structure, and its meaning. He was obsessed with understanding the structure of the human body. To do this, he did something strictly forbidden by both the church and public morality. He performed anatomical dissections. At night, in the cellars of Milan's hospitals, in secret, by the dim, flickering light of a few candles, he risked being accused of witchcraft as he dissected the bodies of executed criminals, the poor, and the elderly who had died alone. Over the course of his life, he would dissect over 30 human bodies, both male and female, including the body of a 100-year-old man, to determine the cause of his death. It was dangerous, gruesome, and repulsive work. Yet his scientific curiosity, his thirst for knowledge, outweighed disgust and fear. With an incredible divine precision and beauty, he recorded everything he saw in his journals. He was the first in history to correctly and detailedly depict the structure of the human heart, its 4 chambers and valves, and to understand its function as a pump, comparing it to the function of canal locks. He was the first to draw a human fetus in the womb, creating an image that remains striking today for its anatomical accuracy and universal tenderness. He studied the structure of bones, muscles, the nervous system, and the brain. He searched within the body for what philosophers called the soul. His anatomical drawings are not just science, they are a synthesis of science and art. He combined the precision of a scientist with the talent of an artist, creating images that are still used in medical atlases today for their informational content and beauty. He was 100, if not 200, years ahead of the official anatomy of his time. Had his research been published then, it would have sparked a revolution in medicine. But Leonardo, as usual, showed his notes to no one. They remained hidden in his encrypted mirror script journals, his personal, secret universe. Finally, Milan became the place where he came closest to his greatest, most obsessive, most insane dream. A dream that had haunted him since childhood, when he would lie in the fields and enviously watch the birds soaring in the sky. The dream of flight. He studied the flight of birds, bats, and insects. He made hundreds of detailed sketches of their wing structures and analyzed air currents. Based on these observations, he began to design flying machines. The most famous of these is the ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings intended to be powered by human muscle. Realizing that muscle power alone might not be enough, he developed designs for apparatuses we would now call hang gliders, capable of using updrafts to glide. And most astonishingly, the famous drawing of the aerial screw, a device made of starched linen that, in his imagination, would screw itself into the air like a corkscrew and ascend vertically. This was effectively the first detailed design for a helicopter in history. He even developed the world's first concept for a parachute. He was closer than ever to realizing his dream. But in 1499, his Milanese idol, his 17-year era of stability and productivity, collapsed. French troops, this time as enemies, once again invaded Italy. Their target was Milan. Ludovico Sforza, betrayed by his own Swiss mercenaries, was forced to flee. The French soldiers stormed the city. They left the Last Supper untouched, although rumors suggest they used the refectory as a stable. But they unleashed their barbaric fury on another of Leonardo's works. The giant clay model of the horse, standing in the courtyard of the Castello Sforzesco, was the perfect target for them. The Gascon archers of the French army used it for target practice, shattering it within a few hours and reducing the 8th wonder of the world to a pile of clay rubble washed away by the rain. For Leonardo, this was the end. His patron was overthrown and soon died in a French prison. His greatest projects were destroyed or remained on paper. At 47 years of age, he was once again an unemployed exile. He packed his priceless notebooks and a few loyal students and left Milan. A new, extremely restless, and perhaps the most tragic phase of his life began, a time of endless wandering. The fall of Milan in 1499 meant more to Leonardo da Vinci than just the loss of his job and patron. It was the collapse of his world. 17 years of stability, nearly unlimited resources, and ambitious projects gave way to an era of uncertainty, wandering, and the humiliating search for a new place in the sun. At 47 years old, no longer young by the standards of the time, he was again a homeless wanderer, traversing war-torn Italy with his most valuable possession, the notebooks filled with his mirror script. His path led him through Mantua, where he made the famous portrait sketch of the powerful Marchioness Isabella d'Este, and then to Venice. In the Republic of Venice, the Queen of the Seas, he once again tried to put his engineering talents to use. The city was threatened by Turkish naval expansion, and Leonardo offered his services to the Senate. He developed plans for mobile underwater barricades to protect the harbor, and, most astonishingly, a detailed design for a diving suit that would allow saboteurs to remain underwater and sink enemy ships. However, the ever-suspicious and conservative Venetians regarded his ideas with mistrust. Once again, his projects remained only on paper. In the year 1500, he finally returned to Florence, the city of his youth, which he had left nearly 20 years earlier. But it had become a different Florence. The city had endured the tyranny of Savonarola and was once again a republic. In the art scene, new, young stars were shining. His old rival, Botticelli, was still working, but the true idol of the new generation was a young, furious, and obsessed genius named Michelangelo Buonarroti. Leonardo's return was triumphant. His fame, especially after the creation of The Last Supper, echoed throughout Italy. The monks of the Servite monastery provided him with lodging and a studio, and the entire city flocked to admire his new cartoon for the painting The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. Contemporaries described this as a pilgrimage, yet behind this outward success lay a deep inner crisis. Leonardo felt like a stranger in this new world. His slowness and his scientific analytical approach to art seemed old-fashioned compared to the stormy, awe-inspiring power of Michelangelo's sculptures. It was at this very moment, in the year 1502, that his life took its most unexpected and darkest turn. He entered the service of the man feared and hated by all of Italy, none other than Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, who was carving out his own state in central Italy with fire and sword. What drove Leonardo, the humanist and nature lover, to enter the service of the most ruthless and perfidious tyrant of his era? Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps the curiosity of a scientist who wished to observe this perfect human predator up close. Perhaps Cesare was also the only one who truly appreciated his talents as a military engineer. Leonardo was given the post of chief military architect and general engineer, with unlimited authority. For nearly a year, he traveled through the territories conquered by Borgia. He created what we would now call modern topographical maps, using instruments he had invented himself. These maps, astonishing in their precision, were not merely works of art. They were a crucial strategic tool that allowed Cesare to move his troops quickly and efficiently. He designed new fortresses, modernized old ones, and developed plans to drain swamps. He was by Cesare's side during his most famous and nefarious operation, the beautiful deception in Senegalia, where he lured his mutinous condottieri captains to peace negotiations and had them all cold-bloodedly strangled. Leonardo witnessed this massacre. He left no written comments on it, but his notebooks from this period featured drawings of bizarre, grotesque faces filled with rage and ugliness, as if he were trying to sketch the very nature of evil. His service with Borgia was an invaluable but terrible education. He saw in Cesare the living embodiment of what he would later call virtù, not virtue in the Christian sense, but courage, energy, and the ability to achieve one's goals by any means necessary. Yet he also recognized the fragility of a power built solely on violence and fortune. When Cesare's father, the Pope, died suddenly, his entire empire collapsed within a few weeks. Leonardo likely learned the most important political lesson. One must not stake everything on a single man. He soon left the service of the fallen tyrant and returned to Florence, and here, in the year 1503, the greatest creative challenge of his life awaited him. The government of the Florentine Republic wished to immortalize its recent military victories and commissioned the two greatest artists of the era to create two gigantic frescoes on the walls of the great council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. The two frescoes were to depict two glorious Florentine victories. One, the Battle of Cascina, was entrusted to the young and defiant Michelangelo. The other, the Battle of Anghiari, was given to the celebrated Leonardo da Vinci. This was not just a job, it was a duel, a battle of titans, a clash of two worlds, two generations, and two philosophies of art. The 50-year-old, elegant and cultivated Leonardo versus the 29-year-old, sullen, unsociable, but titanically energetic Michelangelo. They hated each other. Michelangelo publicly scorned Leonardo for his slowness, for the unfinished horse in Milan, for his dandyish appearance, and even allegedly alluded to his homosexuality. In his youth, Leonardo had indeed been anonymously accused of sodomy, but the case was dismissed. Leonardo, in turn, found Michelangelo's sculptures coarse and graceless, calling his figures sacks of walnuts. All of Florence followed this rivalry with bated breath. Both artists produced full-scale preparatory cartoons. Michelangelo's cartoon depicted soldiers bathing in a river who hear an alarm and scramble frantically to the shore for weapons. It was a hymn to the male body, an anatomical atlas of tensed muscles, a demonstration of incredible mastery in depicting the human form. Leonardo's cartoon was the complete opposite. He chose the most furious, chaotic moment of the battle, the fight for the standard. This was not a parade of muscles, but a tangle of human and equine bodies intertwined in a deadly dance. The warriors' faces were distorted with an inhuman, bestial rage. Leonardo did not want to show heroism, but the bestial madness of war. It was the most powerful anti-war statement in the history of painting. Both cartoons were publicly displayed and caused a sensation. Young artists, including the future genius Raphael, copied them, learning from the two titans, but neither fresco was ever completed. Michelangelo was urgently summoned to Rome by the Pope to work on his tomb before finishing the work, and Leonardo, upon beginning to transfer his drawing to the wall, decided to once again attempt a fatal technical experiment. Just as with the Last Supper, he rejected the traditional fresco technique and used the complex technique of encaustic painting, a method using wax-based paints that he had read about in the works of ancient Romans. He placed braziers in front of the wall to dry the paint, but the heat was insufficient. The colors in the upper part of the fresco began to run, blending together and becoming irreparably damaged. Leonardo abandoned the work in despair. The greatest battle in art history ended in a draw. Both works, Michelangelo's cartoon and Leonardo's fresco, were later lost and are known to us only through copies and engravings. It was during this turbulent period, marked by disappointments, but also by an incredible creative surge between 1503 and 1506, that Leonardo, as Vasari attests, began work on a small portrait. The client was a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, who commissioned a portrait of his young wife, Lisa Gherardini. It was a private, not particularly prestigious commission, yet Leonardo immersed himself in it like nothing else in his life. He worked on this portrait for years. He took it everywhere with him, constantly painting over parts, changing it, and perfecting it. He never delivered it to the client, keeping it with him until his death. Why? What did he find in the face of this ordinary Florentine citizen? In the Mona Lisa, he brought all his artistic and scientific discoveries to absolute perfection. He applied his famous sfumato technique, a barely perceptible haze that softens contours and creates the feeling of living, breathing flesh. He used all his knowledge of optics to create the illusion of a gaze that seems to follow the viewer. And of course, the smile. As an anatomist who knew how every muscle in the face worked, he was able to capture the most fleeting, most elusive moment, the transition from one state to another, the birth of a smile. It is not a smile, but the promise of one, its shadow, its memory. He made a static portrait live in time. But perhaps there was another reason. In the face of the Mona Lisa, in her enigmatic, androgynous beauty, he may have been trying to capture not a specific woman, but a universal image, the very secret of the human soul, which he had spent his life trying to decipher with both the scalpel and the brush. This portrait became his personal philosophical treatise, his magnum opus, into which he poured his entire self. But Florence gave him no peace. The constant accusations of his slowness, the rivalry with Michelangelo, the lack of major engineering projects, all of this weighed on him. And when he was summoned back to Milan in 1506, now under French rule, he gladly accepted. He left Florence again, this time for good. Thus began the final twilight phase of his life, a time he would spend in Rome and finally in France under the protection of a young king who would become his last and most loyal admirer. Leonardo's return to Milan in the year 1506 was like returning to a ghost town set against the backdrop of past glory. The opulent, extravagant, and ambitious court of Ludovico Sforza was no more. The grand military and engineering projects that had so fired his imagination were gone. The city was governed by the French and their governor, Charles d'Amboise. Although he treated Leonardo with enormous, almost reverential respect, he saw in him primarily the great artist, the living legend, and not the universal genius capable of designing cities and armies. Leonardo received the honorary title of Royal Painter and Engineer, and a generous salary that allowed him a carefree life. But there were few large, truly ambitious commissions. This second Milanese period, which lasted about 6 years, became for him a time of relative calm, but also of creative, almost melancholic stagnation. He retreated ever deeper into himself,
into the world of his scientific research, which now interested him far more than painting. He seemed to be trying to make up for what he had missed during his years in the service of tyrants and republics. He delved fervently into geology, studying rock strata and fossilized shells he found high in the Alps. Based on these observations, he arrived at the then heretical idea that the earth was much older than the Bible claimed, that its face was constantly changing, and that the mountains he saw before him had once been the seabed.
He studied botany, how plants grow, and how leaves are arranged on the stem, and discovered the laws of phyllotaxis. He continued his anatomical research, now in collaboration with the young and brilliant professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia, Marcantonio della Torre. Together, they planned the greatest anatomical atlas in history. Leonardo dissected the corpses, and della Torre wrote the explanations. But their collaboration ended tragically when the young professor died of the plague. Leonardo returned once more to his obsessive, lifelong dream of flight, but his designs now became more pragmatic and scientific. He seemed to have recognized the limits of human muscle power and leaned more and more toward the idea of gliding, like large birds, rather than flapping. He studied air currents, vortices, what we now call aerodynamics. He was closer than ever to a solution, but he was running out of time and resources. But this quiet, almost academic period was not to last. In the year 1513, the fragile political balance in Italy was once again shattered. The French were driven out of Milan, and Ludovico Sforza's son, Massimiliano, returned to power. For Leonardo, who had openly served the French, it was dangerous to remain in the city. And once again, at the age of 61, he had to pack his belongings and seek a new patron. This time, his path led him to Rome. At that time, Rome was the center of the Christian world and the new, undisputed capital of art. The Pope was Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, son of the very Lorenzo the Magnificent, under whom Leonardo had begun his career in Florence. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Leonardo. The patronage of the Pope, the wealthiest and most influential man in Europe, could have secured him commissions and resources for the rest of his life. But Rome proved to be the city of his greatest disappointments. Here, in the Vatican, two other titans reigned supreme, his eternal, younger, and more successful rivals. Michelangelo had just completed his gigantic, superhuman work, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which stunned the world with its power and drama. And the young, charming, incredibly productive, and universally beloved Raphael Sanzio was painting the papal apartments, the famous Raphael rooms, creating harmonious, clear, and noble images that were far more pleasing to the papal court than Leonardo's complex, enigmatic, and often unfinished works. The aging, slow Leonardo, obsessed with his scientific experiments and alchemical pursuits, suddenly found himself sidelined. The Pope and cardinals treated him with respect, like a living legend, but gave him no major commissions. He was tasked with minor engineering works, such as a project to drain the Pontine marshes, or asked to invent mechanical toys to amuse the court. He was even accused of witchcraft and necromancy when his anatomical dissections became known, and was officially forbidden from working in the hospitals. In his journals, he wrote with bitterness and sarcasm, "The Medici created me and destroyed me." He felt out of place at this feast of life, like a dinosaur who had outlived a more intellectual era. But just as it seemed his life would end in obscurity, poverty, and disappointment, fate presented him with its final and most generous gift. In the year 1515, the young 20-year-old ambitious and brilliant King Francis I ascended the French throne. He was not only a warrior and a politician, but also a passionate admirer of the Italian Renaissance who revered Leonardo, whose fame had spread throughout Europe. In that same year, Francis marched into Italy, retook Milan in the Battle of Marignano, and there met his idol. He was captivated. Captivated not only by his paintings, but by his mind, his infinite knowledge of everything in the world, and his wisdom. Francis made Leonardo an offer that he, humiliated and forgotten in Rome, could not refuse. He invited him to France, not as a hired specialist who could be dismissed, but as a guest of honor, a friend, a father, and a mentor. He bestowed upon him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, and granted him a huge annual pension that allowed him to live in luxury and worry about nothing. He did not demand paintings or specific projects from him. He wanted only one thing: the opportunity to converse with the greatest mind of his era. In the year 1516, the 64-year-old Leonardo left Italy forever, accompanied by his faithful students Francesco Melzi and Cecilia, as well as his three most beloved, never quite finished paintings, which he carried with him everywhere like a treasure: the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and St. John the Baptist. Slowly, riding a mule, he crossed the Alps and settled in the small, cozy chateau of Clos-Lucé, which was connected by an underground passage to the main royal castle in Amboise. These last 3 years of his life were perhaps his calmest and happiest. Here, in France, he was finally valued not for what he could do, but for who he was. Contemporaries testified that the young king visited him almost every day, sitting for hours in his studio and listening with childlike enthusiasm to his discourse on art, science, philosophy, and the structure of the universe. Leonardo, already old and ill, was busy systematizing his countless notebooks, dreaming of publishing a gigantic encyclopedia of human knowledge. He designed a new ideal city for the king and a royal palace in Romorantin, which was intended to become a new Rome. His right hand was partially paralyzed from a stroke, but he continued to draw and write with his famous, masterful left hand. He died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67. A beautiful, though sadly unlikely, legend holds that he died in the arms of King Francis I himself, who had come to visit his dying friend. In his will, he left his paintings, instruments, and all his priceless manuscripts to his most beloved and faithful student, Francesco Melzi, who dedicated the rest of his life to preserving and systematizing his master's legacy. So, who was he in the end? This astonishing, incomprehensible, almost impossible man. He was neither a villain nor a saint. He was, first and foremost, the most curious person who has ever lived. His primary, all-consuming drive was not a thirst for fame or money, to which he was largely indifferent, but an insatiable, almost childlike thirst for knowledge, what he called saper vedere, the ability to see. He viewed the world not as a given created by God, but as a gigantic, infinitely complex puzzle, a perfect mechanism that could and must be disassembled to understand how it works. Every flower, every bird's flight, every whirlpool, every human face was a cipher to him, which he sought to crack with the rigor of a scientist and the passion of an artist. He was undoubtedly a tragic figure. His illegitimate birth forever made him an outsider in the world of the educated. His genius was so all-encompassing that he could not or would not focus on any single thing, and thus he left behind dozens of unfinished masterpieces and unrealized projects. His scientific discoveries, which could have accelerated human progress in anatomy, geology, optics, and hydrodynamics by a century, remained buried in his coded, scattered journals and had virtually no impact on his contemporaries. In this sense, as a scientist, he suffered a crushing, total defeat. Yet on a much more important fundamental level, he achieved the greatest victory of all. He changed the very idea of what it means to be human and what it means to know the world. Before him, art was a craft, and science was the commentary on ancient texts. Through his example, through his very life, Leonardo demolished the wall between them. He showed that art is science, and science is art. He demonstrated that a true artist must also be an anatomist, an optician, a geologist, and a psychologist, and that a true scientist must possess the imagination, intuition, and sense of beauty inherent in an artist. He was the first truly modern man, standing at the boundary of two worlds, the fading medieval world based on faith and authority, and the emerging new world based on experience, observation, and doubt. He did not discover new laws of physics like Newton or change our view of the cosmos like Copernicus. His greatest discovery was the method itself. The method of knowing the world through precise, unbiased, insatiable observation and experimentation. This is precisely why his legacy consists not only of the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper. His true, living legacy is the 7,000 pages of his journals that have survived. It is a hymn to human curiosity, a monument to the insatiable mind. It is a map for an infinite journey into the depths of the universe and into the depths of the self. Leonardo da Vinci did not decipher God's code, but he showed us how to read it. He taught us to see not just with our eyes, but with our minds, and that is perhaps the greatest gift any single individual has ever left to humanity. He was neither a villain nor a saint. He was simply Leonardo, and that is more than enough to remain forever one of the highest peaks of the human spirit.